Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, and welcome to all my panelists today. And we're going to talk about India's global moment at the G20. India's presidency right now comes at a very, key time in the world, given the geopolitical situation, various tensions, U.S., Russia, U.S., China. India, good friends with Russia, India's tensions with China. You've just had the BRIC summit, which has been fairly successful, this push of the global south. So given all these, what's happening across the world and these geopolitical tensions, how easy or difficult is it for India to navigate these somewhat choppy waters? Ambassador, first to you.
Well, I think it's a very, very difficult time for the world. Because on the one hand, you have all these challenges which have been exacerbating and which don't respect boundaries and require international cooperation. Climate change, pandemics, the global economy, indebtedness of poor countries. These are all issues which don't respect national borders and require a global solution. And on the other hand, you have a global situation which makes cooperation far more difficult than it has been in the past. When the G20 was first set up, or at least I should say first raised to summit level in the wake of the 2008 global financial and economic crisis, it was able to achieve success in stabilizing the economic situation globally and in creating a regulatory framework which would reduce the risk of repetition of such events. And everybody bought into it, including having a coordinated global economic stimulus, signing on to the tighter regulatory frameworks for banks. But then that was at a time when the relationship between the great powers was far less competitive and even hostile than it is today. Today, we see that the strategic competition between the US and Russia, it's a proxy conflict,
right,
has erupted into real conflict. We see the same in terms of the strategic competition between the US and China. That makes actual global cooperation far more difficult. And therefore, India's task has been a very delicate one to navigate through these choppy waters. I think the other element I would like to emphasize is that at the time that G20 was set up, it was still kind of the heyday of globalization. Free trade, free movement of goods and services. Now what we are seeing is a far more nationalistic economic approach from most countries, and protectionism even in those countries which had been the advocates of unimpeded trade and investment, such as the US or in Western Europe, whether it be on the question of protecting their industries, buying American or others. There is a kind of protectionism which has taken hold, and more nationalistic industrial and economic policy. So you have these two things, sharpening geostrategic and geopolitical competition. I would also say geotechnological competition between the US and China, and at the same time, far more restrictive economic policies, less welcoming of free trade. So in this situation, I think India has had a very difficult, unenviable task of trying to forge a consensus, but it has taken the issues head on and tried to at least shape the agenda and move the needle forward on many of these issues. Now, most of these issues are not such that they are, that they enable immediate solutions. I think if you're looking at climate change, it will require action going up to 2050. So what we can do is to accelerate the process, maybe move the needle forward, and that is what we have tried to do.
All right, Ashok, Malik, your views on this. And India's done a lot of fine balancing in these last few years when it comes to, our long-standing friendship with Russia, our friendship with the US just now, given the Prime Minister's trip, with Iran as well. Iran thanked India after the expansion of BRICS and its inclusion. So a lot of fine balancing when it comes to our foreign policy. And now with the G20 presidency, how do you see that?
Every G20 summit or conference or presidency takes place in a particular context. The G20 began really as a response to the global financial crisis of 2008, and it was 20 large countries coming together as a global financial management, cabinet or cohort, if you will. If you look at the context of the Indian presidency, it is very different. Every decade in foreign policy gives you one or two shocks. The 2020s have given you 3 shocks already. The COVID shock, the Ukraine war, and the clear geopolitical divide between the US and China, which is forcing many countries to choose. In fact, it's forcing all countries to make some sort of a choice. So 3 shocks in 3 years or 4 years means that this presidency has a very troubled and a very complex agenda. These shocks have led to multiple implications. One, of course, is insufficient bandwidth and resourcing for climate change and climate finance. Second, there is a commodities crisis, particularly a food and energy crisis. There's simply not enough food and energy for all the people of the world. And we're seeing that over the past 2 or 3 years. A third, in terms of sensitive technologies, critical and emerging technologies, countries are being forced to make choices and come to political compromises. Economic choices are being affected by politics. And finally, of course, there's one window of hope, which is everyone's betting on digital public infrastructure, and everyone wants to get onto that train as quickly as possible. The battle really is for the hearts and minds of the global south. The countries that are not part of the G20, that are not rich countries, that are not very developed countries or emerging economies of a significant nature, but countries that are facing the brunt of the 3 shocks of this decade. And I think what India's presidency has done is bring the global south and its concerns right to the heart of the G20. In some senses, this is the second of 4 successive developing country presidencies. Indonesia last year, India this year, then you have Brazil and South Africa. And the character of G20 is being defined by this presidency and the presidencies around it. From a pure financial management model, it is becoming more of a developmental model, a developmental agenda. India can take some credit for that transition.
All right. I also want to talk about the G20 being spread across, as we've seen in the build-up, across 200 cities. There have been a lot of questions and interest regarding that. And in the previous session, we talked about Srinagar at length. But what do you think this has achieved when it comes to foreign policy specifically?
I think one thing I notice is how much interest in the Indian population is there today on foreign policy. That foreign policy is no longer an elite activity, which has historically been just diplomats in pinstripes. I mean, with apologies to Ambassador Shankar, that to one where actually there is much greater interest today, because India itself has globalized, that it is connected far more deeply to the world. For example, in a $3.5 trillion GDP, we have almost $1.3 trillion of trade. So India has never been as connected. Indian students travel, Indians are traveling for tourism. So it's really an India that's connected. So I think one of the things this government has done is really to take advantage of that, and take foreign policy activity to the people, to different corners of the country. In the past too, we used to do occasional conferences outside Delhi. But in this case, we've seen last 10 years, I mean, frequent attempts at taking multilateral meetings outside, bilateral meetings outside. For example, when the Japanese Prime Minister came, Mr. Modi went to Varanasi in Ahmedabad, in Goa, in various places we've seen foreign policy activity come. I think what the G20 has done is really to take it to a new level of engagement with the Indian public. And I think from what we've seen, really, there's a lot of positive response to it. So the challenge would be to build on this further, that how do we mobilize the popular interest in actually giving greater support for India's engagement with the world.
Right, Ambassador Shankar, something you'd like to add to this, taking it to 200 cities, interest in the Indian population, but also when it comes to foreign policy and having all these delegates travel to other cities, what has it meant for the G20?
Well, I think it makes foreign policy live, if I may say so. Otherwise, it's an issue which is dealt with, as Ragmohan said, by people in pinstripes. But to that, I'd like to add women in saris too.
Of course.
And because it's no longer a man's world only. It's made people aware that foreign policy impinges on their day-to-day lives. For instance, if we are able to get more financing, climate financing, which will enable our energy transition to renewable energies or cleaner energies such as hydrogen in a more affordable, more sustainable manner without some of the risks which might currently be associated with it, I think that would impact the daily lives of people, because people are not aware in India that foreign policy impacts their daily lives. What we negotiate and concede, say for instance at the WTO in agriculture, will impact on every farmer in India. What we negotiate in terms of free trade pacts, I think again impacts sometimes adversely on our small and medium industries, and we have to be very conscious of that when we negotiate, that we don't only negotiate for the moment or a photo opportunity, but that we keep in mind the long-term impact that this will have on the future of the country. And I think what this does is to make this alive to people in different parts of the country.
All right. Ashok Malik, you both were talking about the context, the relevance of the G20, the situation in which it came around originally. And it's very interesting because, coming up to this year, our presidency, you see a multipolar world order sort of emerging in a sense. And there's, so much talk on that, so much is happening on that. So on that front, how is India poised?
It's a very confused world order. It's not there's no clarity about it being either a bipolar world or a multipolar world. There are two very
there are efforts on
there are two very significant powers in the world which have a near global bandwidth, the US and to a lesser degree China. And then there are a number of other powers which matter a great deal, and especially in their regions. So in the Indo-Pacific, certainly India is an important power. You could call it a pole, you could call it a sub-pole. I don't think we have the terminology for it yet, but it is a significant power. But I do believe that in different themes, on different areas of endeavor, on the international stage, in the global economy, in global politics, different countries matter in different ways. So I think if you look at the way the global order developed after the Second World War, there was a lot of institution building in the Euro-Atlantic region, in the region between the United States and Europe, because that's the region that saw two great wars in a generation. The desire to rebuild Europe, to build peace, permanent peace in Europe and the Euro-Atlantic region led to a great institution building endeavor there. That process is just about beginning in the Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific has now replaced the Euro-Atlantic, in a sense, as the locus of the global economy. So we're still at the very early stage of it. The G20 is one response, the Quad is another response, AUKUS is a third response. There will be multiple responses. I don't think we are at a multipolar world yet, or even at a proper bipolar world. But by the end of this decade, perhaps, we'll have a clearer answer. And this is going to be a very defining and transformative decade for the global system.
All right. A joint statement could not be agreed on. We do have an outcome statement. And this is not just this year, even the previous year, that this was a challenge. And so what are our expectations from the summit now?
Look, I think, as we said, there are two big problems in the world today. The great powers are at each other's throats. There's a real war happening in the heart of Europe. And second, the economic order that the globalization structure that we were familiar with for the last 3 decades is breaking down. So on core issues that there is no agreement. And it's quite clear that we're not going to bridge that very easily. I think that's why the G20 is particularly challenging. I think what I see today is what India has done in the last few months is really to create a range of other areas where agreement can be produced. That is from digital public infrastructure or on trade facilitation. In fact, even yesterday, the trade ministers had agreed on a few things. So I think by pushing on so many diverse fronts and to at least get some agreements where there are possible, because on the 2 basic issues, there's not much agreement, but there's a lot of agreement on other issues. The trick and the success would be if we can still manage to get a joint statement where, like in Bali,
Yes.
where diplomats are paid to do this, but there's ways in which language can be crafted, the difficult parts can be moved to a footnote, countries that they don't like can be dissociate themselves with an asterisk. So there are possibilities. I think I'm still 50-50. I would think there's a reasonable chance still you could come up with a document that might still be able to, everyone could sign and live with. And I think that's the story for the next few days, that the trade ministers meeting, I think, seemed to give us some hope. But I would say when the foreign ministers come, before the leaders themselves meet, so there is room here for quite a bit of diplomacy in the next few days.
All right. Ambassador Shankar, also the war in Ukraine has brought focus on food security. And already after COVID, supply chains have been in focus. So for India, this is both a challenge and an opportunity?
Yes, but I would say more the realization, I think, on food security, we have to work much harder to look long-term, and I think Mr. Shringla referred to it, yes. To adapt agriculture for coming climate change. And here crops like millets will play a very important role because they are so hardy. They can grow in semi-arid conditions. They don't require much water, and they can withstand extremes of heat. So this kind of transformational shift in agriculture is something which India is seeking to propel, and I think that is going to be an opportunity and very forward-looking. But at the same time, I would say the realization that over-dependence on one country during the pandemic had led to disruption of supply chains and shortages of essential commodities across the globe. And even now, the dominance of single countries in areas such as critical minerals or rare earths and things which are all going to be required by all countries if we are to make the transformative transitions on energy and technology which we need to make for climate change, then we have to look at establishing diversified supply chains and strengthening their resilience. And I think in that lies an opportunity for India, because India has the possibility with its technological capabilities to emerge as one of the countries in that diversified supply chain. As of now, we are seeing only the beginnings, the incipient beginnings with Apple and Foxconn doing part of their manufacturing in India, and now the decision of Micron to have a final packaging plant for semiconductors in India. But I think we can accelerate this, and we should try in every way to do so, because much of the investment has been flowing to Southeast Asia, to Vietnam or Mexico. Not so much has come to India. And it means we as a country need to do more to get that here and to establish that ecosystem.
All right. Ashok Malik, on the issue of climate change, India's position, it being able to champion underdeveloped countries when it comes to negotiating with the West, and this is a big role that India has been playing and will and can continue to play when it comes to negotiations on this.
You know, the key issue on climate change, since many major countries have already set their net zero target years, the key issue is climate finance. Who pays and how smoothly do capital flows...
Something that India has been pushing at every
yes,
forum.
How smoothly does capital flow towards projects, which in the end will deliver both economic returns as well as returns for the planet. But which are projects which are located in countries that are far away from where the money is currently lying. So whether it's energy transition, whether it's climate adaptation, whether it's resilient infrastructure, you need investment for these for products that are available in the capital markets, but products that are underserved by the current amount of investment. And the key issue really is if I'm an investor or an equity fund sitting in Canada or the US, am I happy with small, modest, but guaranteed returns at home? Or am I willing to take a bet and invest in projects in maybe Asia, where the need is much more for climate finance, where the returns will be much larger, but where I am inhibited because I'm simply ignorant about that market. And that is a constant tussle, really, between inhibition and removing that inhibition. I think India's brought that issue to the table in a big way, but obviously much work remains to be done.
Right, and in the past we used to see India and China, coming together on this, but of late not so much. It's been India and the other countries, India championing the cause, China is also there. Talking about India-China relations and the various issues and especially coming together on climate change. But what we saw in BRICS just now, there was a conversation between Prime Minister Modi, Xi Jinping. There was a little quibbling on how that came about. Your views on that?
Look, I think the China issue, I fear, might actually overshadow the G20 summit. I mean, that we saw in BRICS. See, once you have the media interest immediately, this complex, details of a multilateral world, to saying, will they meet or will they not meet? If they met, was it a conversation? Was it a meeting? Was it a pull aside? So I think seemingly there was some guidance from the two leaders to move forward on the boundary dispute. So we still don't have the final word, but Mr. Xi Jinping will actually come. So if he comes, and the last few weeks, there have been intense negotiations on the boundary issue by our military commanders. So if there is progress in the next few days, then I think in India-China confrontation easing would be big news, but will also, I think, create a good atmosphere for the larger dynamic in the G20 summit. But then this has been going on for 70 years. I mean, you have to be utterly optimistic to believe breakthroughs can happen in two meetings. It's a very complex dispute. It's a very difficult dispute. So I wouldn't raise hopes, but I think something seems to be cooking at this point.
Ambassador Shankar?
On the same issue? Well, I think that, China has adopted a far more assertive and sometimes even aggressive approach on boundary issues with its neighbors, whether it is the maritime boundary in the East China Sea, South China Sea, or the land boundary with India. And their policy basically says that China must establish its sovereignty over every inch of disputed territory, which obviously sets it up for conflict, because these are areas where there are conflicting claims. And if the issue is to be settled on the basis of force and on the basis of one side's claims, then that doesn't leave room for a meeting ground. But we have to see whether, the efforts at negotiating de-escalation and disengagement, troop withdrawals, military infrastructure removals, from the confrontation on the border in the Depsang and Demchok areas is successful. And then there's the larger question of the boundary itself and confidence-building measures on the line of control. Because the confidence-building measures on the line of control had held the peace for 20 years, even though the line was undefined and remains undefined even now. The question is, with Chinese actions, these CBMs were shattered. And now the question is, how do we restore that trust? How do we build new confidence-building measures, or how do we settle the boundary? How do we settle the LAC? These are much larger questions which will remain open for much longer, I'm afraid. At best, at the present juncture, you might see intensified efforts to local de-escalation and disengagement and de-escalation.
And what Raja Mohan felt that could this overshadow what we're watching at the G20 summit, or what is your view on that?
No, well, obviously,
I know we, the media, are always like very interested, and the questions and speculations continue.
Every SAARC meeting would be overtaken by the Pakistani and Indian Prime Minister's meeting. I guess this one will, to some degree, be hijacked by what the Indian and Chinese leaders say to each other. I think it was always on the cards that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi would interact in some form before G20 to, if nothing else, smoothen the pathway to President Xi's participation, possible participation. So I was not really surprised that they interacted
in South Africa.
In South Africa. But as Ambassador Shankar said, to suggest that this can automatically lead to a very complex border situation being smoothened and resolved, perhaps you could see some tactical disengagement from a couple of locations, but a broader de-escalation, I don't think that's happening in a hurry. Also, quite honestly, even if there is a de-escalation, even if China says we'll go back to those 4 border agreements they tore up in the last few years, I think Indian strategy has also evolved. The Indian mood has evolved. The public mood has evolved, which is also an important determinant in a democracy. So both countries have moved on significantly since March 2020 or April 2020. I don't think the India-China issue can be brought back to where it once was.
And that little quibbling that took place post talks,
I think it's
how
more,
it came about,
yeah.
India had one version, Chinese officials.
Both countries will have their...
Does this always create a little like aftertaste? Yes.
Have you seen The Great Dictator with Charlie Chaplin, where you have Hitler and Mussolini in chairs and each one trying to be a little higher than the other?
So it's a bit of that.
So I think you're seeing a little bit of that from the Chinese side.
All right, well, let's move away from that. Talking about all these new groupings that we now have, and there are various cliques and groupings, and there's Quad and there's BRICS, there's expanded BRICS. Now, does this create more confusion?
I wouldn't use the word cliques. That's a Chinese word these days. So the Chinese say, look, when they sit with the Russians, that is not a clique, but when India sits with the Americans, it becomes a clique. So I think the Chinese attempt at presenting their views as global views, I think there is a backlash to it in Asia. They might do very well in Africa, where they're far away. But if you look at what's happened in Asia in the last 1 year, I mean, you have Japan and South Korea are almost like India, Pakistan. I mean, they have a huge historical problems. But today they've come together with the US to oppose China. So that's a trilateral that has emerged. There is the US, Japan, Australia, Philippines, because Philippines has been at the receiving end of Chinese bullying for almost 10 years. So finally you have actually they're standing up today. And then you have the AUKUS, which is Australia, US, UK, trying to develop nuclear submarines to deal with the Chinese maritime threat. And then you have the India in a Quad.
Yes.
And
then we also have the I2U2, where India is part of, along with Israel, the United States and the United Arab Emirates. So I think small groups were always there. It's not some new thing that has happened. It is when one country tries to dominate a region, there are two kinds of reactions. One, which is to create an alliance of the kind that NATO and others. But what we're seeing today is really forming overlapping networks which can limit a one power from unilaterally trying to change borders, like what China does here, what Russia has done in Europe, that the need to protect sovereignty, territorial integrity of states. If that is the aim, how do you produce that result? Through deterrence. So that's the reason why you have new groups that are emerging. And I think those will be there. And my sense is Chinese don't like it, but because they say, look, it is their word or, my way or highway kind of an attitude. But I think the rest of the world is simply not going to roll over and simply accept the Chinese claim. So people will form associations, people will form groups to deal with what they see as fundamental threats to their national security.
Okay, and I'll open it up also for more questions, but yes, to add
comment.
to that.
I just say that in a situation where the world is in flux and the old settled relationships are shifting, I think you're going to see what I call the variable geometry of international cooperation. It's not going to be set-piece groupings of known powers. It will be shifting and overlapping groupings, but the world will eventually either emerge as multipolar or it will emerge as bipolar. And this is a kind of transitional phase where you're going to see a lot of fluidity. And for India, it's important to retain flexibility.
I'd just like to point out to one thing here. There are old groupings, there are new groupings. Groupings will always be formed and reshaped in the international order, but the relative weight of groupings keeps changing. In that context, the decision by the US president not to go to meet the ASEAN countries and not to attend the East Asia Summit, which was really set up with American support many years ago, but to come to the G20 and to come to India's G20 sends a very significant message. And we should be alive to that.
Yes.
All right, I'd like to open it up. Any questions? Yes, go ahead. If we can get a mic here. Do I give my mic? Uma, mic.
There's been so much talk about the G20, and recently President Putin has said that he won't be attending India's summit. So what do you reckon is the politics behind that? What would be your, from your experience, what would you consider is the rationale and the deeper workings guiding that decision?
I think he's under pressure because of Ukraine, but also anticipates that he will be under pressure from the Western Bloc were he to come. So on both counts, perhaps sometimes discretion is the better part of valor.
He didn't attend BRICS either. Yes, go ahead. Can we get the mic there?
Hello, everyone. There is a biggest player of climate finance existing in the market. So how will we beat that through G20 summits?
Sorry, I didn't hear you clearly.
I'm asking, there is a biggest player of climate finance existing in the market on global level. So how will we beat that through the G20 summits?
Climate financing.
Yeah.
Well, climate financing is an area where I think we are really falling short. But some innovative suggestions have been made in this presidency of the G20 by India. And while we have been demanding that the developed countries provide, financing, which is public financing, to help developing countries undertake mitigation and adaptation to climate change, it hasn't been forthcoming. Even the pledge of $100 billion made earlier has not been fulfilled. First COVID, then the war in Ukraine, then the faltering economies, and they say they are not in a position to give. So what has been suggested now is that we draw in the multilateral, A, the private sector, and B, the multilateral development institutions. Now, if we look at private financing for climate change, then it is not available in sufficient quantities. I think very little comes to the developing world. B, the costs of it are much higher than in the developed world because they see it as risky. So the risk cost that you have to pay as developing countries for private capital for climate finance is very much higher.
Right,
so the suggestion is that the multilateral development banks or other institutions could provide an insurance cover or a guarantee to the private lenders, which would bring down their risk factor and therefore reduce the total cost of climate finance and make available more climate finance to the developing world. Of course, in addition, we would need subsidized public finance for various efforts, but this is a new suggestion and one worth considering, and I hope it remains on the agenda.
This has been the huge challenge always, this climate finance. One last question. Yes, young man there.
Hello, ma'am. Hello, sir. So this is Gaurang from Jagan Institute of Management Studies. My question to you is, how do you think this G20 presidency is going to affect the employability rate of India?
Big concern among the
very
youth.
crisp
Ashok
question
Malik.
to you all.
All right, Ashok Malik, there's something you'd like to answer?
I don't think G20 directly affects employment, but I think this G20 presidency takes place at a time of great shifts in the global economy, in global supply chains. And as Ambassador Shankar pointed out, we are moving from a 20 or 30-year era when there was great sourcing concentration on one geography, China really, to a more diversified manufacturing ecosystem, where India will not be the only beneficiary, far from it. Mexico, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Vietnam, of course, are also vying for the same supply chains. But India can, because of its size, because of its scale, can certainly host a very significant quantum of the global value chains. And those will create jobs, both first-order direct jobs and second-order indirect jobs. But that process perhaps would be accentuated by the fact that we're hosting the G20 and we're coming into the limelight. But that is a broader process, a broader endeavor for Indian foreign policy and economic management, which I think will play out through this decade.
Anything you'd like to add, Rajamohan, to that? I think the young people looking to see.
India is quite well placed because at a time when the rest of the world, there is general stagnation. Even China is slowing down. So my sense is India's opportunities have grown significantly in the last few years. I mean, earlier, Ambassador Meera Shankar talked about Apple, Foxconn, the demand for India's technical talent. And everywhere today, our government negotiates this migration and mobility agreements to run the new technology industries. So US, you already see it's mostly Indians doing so well. And I think the demand is now spreading to across the world. If you've done IT engineering, of course, you are top of the list. But my sense is most of the skills that are needed in this new age will be in great demand. And I think India's population profile, as well as the latent talent in this country, I think they're well placed to take advantage of a new international situation.
Let me just add here, I think that, you're seeing the world economy, the technology economy move towards digitization, and from digitization to artificial intelligence, and now space and quantum computing. There are a whole range of new breakthroughs which are on the horizon, beyond the horizon. And I think India has the possibility to scale up and master these technologies and to establish mutually beneficial collaborative arrangements with many of the developed countries, particularly the US, as we did with the IT sector, which grew on the back of linkages with the US economy. In that, we are helped by, say what the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called the new US policy of friend-shoring. That is, setting up offshore production or collaboration facilities in countries where they have mutual trust. I think that will benefit India. The big challenge is going to be not those who are highly qualified and can move up the value chain. The big challenge is going to be mass employment, because this is a factor all over the world, that new investments in manufacturing are now yielding fewer and fewer jobs with all the automation that is taking place. So it's a challenge not just for India, certainly very serious for India, but also for the world. And here we may have to look at much lower levels of manufacturing which provide mass employment and where we have been significantly weak. So like textiles, garments, leather, there are a range of areas which can provide agri-industries, which can provide mass employment. We have to also focus, along with the high-tech, we have to also focus on that.
All right, and that brings us to the end of this session. I'd like to thank all the panelists for joining us today on the Conclave and talking about all these issues, answering questions. Thank you so much, everyone.